Welcome, everybody. My name is Matt Kibbe. I am the president and chief community organizer at Free the People. And I want to start off by thanking all of you for joining us. We have practitioners and activists and people doing the hard work on the ground. We've had tremendous demand for this event tonight, so I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank Americans for Prosperity and Stand Together, our partners in this project. And I'm really excited about this. And I'll talk about what we want to accomplish with restorative justice in just a second. But for now, let me just give you a brief overview of what Free the People is. Our job is to translate public policy and deep ideas into compelling human stories and put them on video and make them accessible to people who are never going to be interested in picking up a white paper, but they care passionately about these shared values and making their communities better. And our job at Free the People is to get people emotionally invested in real change. And what we're going to talk about tonight is actually taking the ideas that you're going to see in our documentary, How to Love Your Enemy, a Restorative Justice Story, and translate that into action on the ground where you live right now. Before we came up with the idea for this event, which is really just scaling a prototype that we did in an actual pop-up theater in Eagle County, Colorado. We had attendees from law enforcement, the district attorney's office, Black Lives Matter was there. So were activists across the political spectrum looking to take what they've accomplished in Longmont, Colorado, which you will see in this documentary, and transplant that and do that in their community as well. And when we made this movie, we thought we were telling a human story, but upon watching it and upon watching the heightened sense that something is wrong with our justice system in this country, we realized that this is a how to do it. This is the beginning of a toolkit that can help you implement these same policies that have been so successful in Longmont, Colorado. So I'm really looking forward to this. This is an innovative approach to policy change. Like I said, all of you are going to scale this model tonight, and you're going to meet the practitioners. But for now, let me introduce you to Angelette from Americans for Prosperity, who's going to tell you a little bit about why they're involved and what they're interested in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, and especially good afternoon to those who are tuning in from the West Coast. My name is Angelette Avilés, and I'm here representing Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And I wanted to thank you for all responding to our invitation for this documentary screening and Q&A session that we'll have immediately after. In addition, it's been a pleasure and an honor working alongside with the team with Free the People to share this inspiring film with you all. For over 20 years, our nonprofit organization has been creating real change at the local, state, and federal levels by educating and training Americans to be advocates for freedom. Across our country, our programs and events allow us to share knowledge and tools that encourage participants like yourself to work towards finding innovative solutions to remove barriers within the four key institutions of society in education, business, communities, and government. However, there are times when education and training are not enough to motivate and encourage citizens to become advocates for change, or as we like to say, to become social change entrepreneurs. We understand that sometimes in order to touch or even change the hearts and minds of many individuals, it takes a story. It takes a personal story, whether from one person or several people like you are about to see in this documentary. Thus, here we are today. Instead of reinventing the wheel, many times we come across organizations like Free the People or individuals who share similar visions and goals as we do so that we can stand together and share our knowledge and resources to make an even greater impact. So we hope to hear from you soon, and we are looking forward to your feedback from a survey that you'll be receiving in the next day or so. So once again, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to join us today. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
At one point, years and years ago, the Longmont Police Department was kind of a faceless entity that lived in a fortress, and it didn't have a lot of connections with the community. At one time, we were at war with the media. We were at odds with a lot of other entities within the community, especially the Latino community. There had been an incident in this community back in 1980 where a white police officer killed 2 Hispanic boys. And we had, in essence, our own Ferguson times 5 in terms of what this community went through. There was a tremendous amount of pain, and a lot of that pain had a lot to do with what and how this police department was operating within the community.
When I was a kid, I heard a term from one of my older friends one day, and it stuck with me forever. And he says, it's the Longmont Thug Squad. That's what they called the police department, the Longmont Thug Squad. It just kind of was something that all the kids went around and told each other, like, don't interact with the cops, don't interact with the cops.
Conversations were very retributive and punitive in their orientation. The way we were going to make this community safe is by catching the bad persons, putting them in jail, and punishing them so that they couldn't do that anymore. Well, that's not how the criminal justice system works. It never worked that way. There's just not enough room for it to work that way. And in essence, justice was defined as a pound of flesh, an eye for an eye, relatively primitive ways of seeing justice.
There's so many antiquated systems, and the way that we're dealing with things as a society. So we do have to start thinking of different ways.
I like to describe Longmont as the center of the triangle between Denver, Fort Collins, and Boulder. It's right in the middle of it all. You're about 45 minutes away from everything, but at the same time, you feel like you're forever away from everything.
I think living in Longmont's like living in a big small town. It's got a lot of the small town identity and community, but it's big enough to have great resources and abilities.
I like a lot of things about Longmont, but mostly the community. You can pretty much walk everywhere. You can get from one side of town to the other pretty quickly.
We have a bowling alley and a movie theater, and that's about it.
Longmont is a really wonderful place to live and work. It's a city close to 100,000 people. It's a pretty diverse city. We have about 30% of our city is Latino and Hispanic identifying.
Yeah, Longmont's definitely changed. When I was a kid, I remember it was kind of it was always referred to as like the small farming community. We did a lot of produce growing here, so a lot of summertime farmers' fields, and then in the wintertime the population would dwindle down. So it was kind of just a small, sleepy community. We never locked our doors. I tell people I never had a house key until I moved out. 18 years old, senior in high school, didn't even have a house key because I'd come home late at night, my door would be unlocked. That was just the type of community Longmont was. And then kind of the tech boom happened and the population boom happened, and it seemed like within about a decade, the town grew from 40,000 to 97,000 people, and it's with it has brought a lot of the other issues big cities have now, where people are a little less connected to their communities. It's more just kind of go home, unplug, and not really talk to their neighbors type stuff. So we've seen a lot more of that lately, but I still think and hold in my heart that Longmont's still the true Longmont it was when I was growing up.
We knew that when we arrested or summoned somebody, that didn't necessarily solve any problem. In fact, now you hear the phrase, you can't arrest yourself out of these social and health issues. So we dealt with a lot of things, whether it was addiction, whether it was mental health, whether it was kids, whether it was any kind of crime. We just came down with that kind of hammer and came down with that kind of, and that was the community's expectation.
We are fairly certain in most cases that the criminal justice system doesn't really work, and especially with juveniles. Also, they make bad decisions. Their brain is not fully developed, and their decision centers are not fully developed.
In a criminal justice world, everything is number-based. The judge doesn't know your name. He knows a docket number. The people in the jail don't know your name, they know your jail jacket number. The police officer doesn't know your name, he knows a case number.
So having worked in the criminal justice system for decades, I saw it as very dysfunctional when we have a 50%, 60% recidivism rate of people who go to prison. 50 to 60% go back to prison within 3 years. So we're not really rehabilitating, we're not really transforming people, we're punishing them for something that they have done, oftentimes with extraordinarily long sentences. The United States has gotten to the point where we're incarcerating more people in this country than any other country in the world by magnitudes of 5, 6, 7 times. And with no consequent increase in public safety and with no effective remedial result. We're not changing behavior.
We all know that there's a certain level of futility. There's a great failure rate in terms of recidivism. So we did this study. I had a research and development person who did a study on the people that we had arrested one year. We arrested like 235 or so people for felony breaking into cars, felony breaking into houses, and felony vandalism. And when we went back and looked at their history of 235 people, we found out that on average they had been arrested 9 times prior to that year, and that they had 16 charges against them. And so I presented this information not only to our staff, but to our community, and to kind of say that, you know, none of us live our lives this way, at least I hope you don't, where you're going to do something over and over and over again, and maybe on the 10th time it's going to work. Normally, when after 1 or 2 times, we're going to say, well, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we're up to 10 times here, folks, and so can we at least think about another alternative? There was a kind of a push within policing to move from the reactive kind of policing where you just go to calls for service and you react to what's out there, to a more proactive, preventative, personal way of doing policing. And the kind of the title of that was called community policing. We did a lot of work in Longmont to create partnerships within the community. We worked a lot on opening ourselves up, on becoming a more personable police department with the community, and so we worked a lot on partnerships. I go back to a very, very good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Beverly Title, who brought the concept of restorative justice to me. And just know at that time, too, that in my head, I wasn't necessarily looking for something, but I believed that there might be something else that we could do outside of the criminal justice, invoking the criminal justice system. And so I was kind of ready and prepared for anything. But when she brought it to my attention, I was, I guess I'll say my eyebrows raised. And it got my attention because it took into account, one of the main things for me was this people choosing accountability versus people being forced to be accountable, or there was legislation that was going to try to make people accountable. I was also a big fan of giving the victims more of a voice in what was happening, because the victim's voice, there's no legal provision within the criminal justice system for a victim's voice to be heard. And I said, I want to explore this more. I want to see what the possibilities are.
So my name is Summer Deaton, and my mom, Dr. Beverly Title, actually founded the Longmont Community Justice Partnership. Well, that came 25 years ago. And she had left the school district when she turned 50 and wanted to dedicate the rest of her life to peacemaking.
Both Mike Butler and Dr. Beverly Title are visionaries, and they saw a way of doing things differently in Longmont. Beverly initially as an educator, Mike from the perspective of public safety. And so it was really those two great minds coming together, those two very charismatic leaders coming together in Longmont that made restorative justice possible.
So restorative justice is a huge umbrella term, and I think of it at its most core is bringing together victims and offenders when there's something that's been done, a harm that's been created, and trying to figure out a solution that can make that right to the biggest extent possible.
Why does Longmont need restorative justice? The same reason everybody does. I think we all make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes in life. And some people make mistakes that maybe it's their biggest mistake in their life, and they get into criminal trouble. And I don't think anybody deserves to be defined by the worst mistake they've ever made.
Many government programs are designed in a way that says only the government can come up with a solution. I would rather convene and facilitate a group of community members who can say, here's what we believe the problem is and here's what we believe the solution is, than have the government from on high say, here's what the problem is and here's what the solution is. This is not a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. This is how healthy communities, I believe, are made.
My outlook on Longmont has changed a lot. As a kid, it was always just, oh, it's my hometown. Everyone hates their hometown when they're a kid. Everyone just wants to get out. But once I started really getting involved with this and kind of slowly falling back in love with Longmont and just like, wow, like we actually have a lot of really cool people here who do a lot of really awesome things. And like we're, in a way, kind of pioneering this weird like restorative justice thing for at least our area. And it's really incredible to see that and be able to look at people and personally understand like, oh, you're just a person. You're not your decisions. You're not any of that.
Restorative justice actually looks like a lot of different things at this point in Colorado and throughout the country. And so LCJP has a really unique model because we partner with police, and that's a fairly uncommon application of restorative justice. We're also unique because we work with both youth and adult offenders. So what happens in our process is the police officer is called out on from dispatch. There's a call for service. When the officer makes contact with the victim and offender, the officer can use their discretion to offer restorative justice. So the things that they're looking for is the offender, or we call them the responsible person when they come to us, is the offender taking responsibility for their actions? The second criteria is the victim okay with the case not going to court, so not going the conventional criminal justice route. If those two criteria are met, those are sort of the baseline making a case eligible for restorative justice.
Well, I met Dan, if I can call you Dan.
Absolutely.
After I was involved with my aunt in a physical altercation and was looking at being arrested.
She left out the part where she first met me by trying to turn herself in for something that wasn't reported yet. I was at the police department doing something totally unrelated, just happened to be in an area where this young lady came walking in and looked fairly distraught, and I asked her, if I could help her, and she said she was here to turn herself in. I said, okay, automatically believing, okay, we get people that come in all the time to turn themselves in on arrest warrants. Okay, she has an arrest warrant. So I get her driver's license, get her ID, go back to our records personnel. They run her name and say, no, she doesn't have any warrants. Okay, well, she'll be relieved and happy about that. So I went and told her, you don't have any warrants? And she said, no, I was in a fight. I want to turn myself in for this fight. It's okay, so then I call our dispatch center and do we have any reports of a fight lately? And our dispatch says, no reports of a fight. Okay, now I'm thinking this lady's maybe a little off, and she's seeing things that aren't quite there.
So that officer writes up a report. There is a pending criminal charge. So the people who come to us have not been charged criminally. There's no conviction.
Initially, we only referred kids. We only referred first-time offenders, and we only referred misdemeanors. So the cases were a little bit more lightweight on the front end.
Then in the community group conference, or the circle, people often call it the circle, that brings together the two facilitators, the harmed and responsible parties, 2 volunteer community members, so we also train community representatives to participate, and the officer who referred the case, ideally. If the officer who referred the case doesn't want to participate, we will pull in a different officer.
When we introduced restorative justice, we knew that we were introducing a practice that was different than arresting people and summoning people. And initially many of our officers thought it was just a little bit touchy-feely, and that this couldn't possibly work. We had a great year. I mean, there was a great track record in terms of what happened. And so over time, we kept track of that track record. Hundreds, thousands of people who went through restorative justice, recidivism rates remaining the same, 10% or less, victim satisfaction rates up in the mid-90s, and our officers not seeing these people again.
LCJP became under the leadership of Kathleen. Statistics and numbers started coming out a lot more, and one of the things that blew us away was how low the recidivism rate is for this program. These are people that are still held accountable with community service, with monetary fines, with doing projects that they wouldn't normally do. They're volunteering.
One of the most important pieces of data that we collect is victim satisfaction, and we have 100% victim satisfaction, victims saying that the offender, the responsible person, was held accountable for their actions.
So that is one of my big tools that I go to with the skeptics and say, okay, well, if you look at the criminal justice system, it's like a black hole. It's incredibly easy to take one misstep and get sucked right in, and it's very, very hard, if not for some people impossible, to get back out of. The restorative justice process, because we put a name to it and not just a number, that person goes into it feeling like they have more ownership of their own outcome than they do in the criminal justice world.
I am just wondering, like, why me? Why my property? I was just like, where do I live? You know, it's just kind of, I felt violated.
Within restorative justice and our circles, the opportunity for the victim to be heard and be there is something that's really powerful. And it's really powerful for the responsible party to actually hear those words of how that person in particular was affected. Not just, oh, well, this affects a variety of people for these reasons and things like that. Like, that's kind of my job as a community member. But when you're there with someone, you're like, holy cow, like, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I hurt you in that way specifically. It's really something that's very powerful. And a lot of harmed parties end up also feeling more at ease at the end, and they understand the other side as well more, where because everyone gets the opportunity to speak and no one's interrupted and there's not really a place for argument or anything like that, it's really just an understanding moment where the victim can look at someone and say, wow, I didn't understand I hurt you that way, and the harmed party can look at that responsible party and say, wow, like, I didn't realize that you were going through these things in life, or this is what affected your decisions. Like, and there's just that opportunity for exchanging. And it's something that's really powerful and really cool to see in a moment with people.
So one of my kiddos' friends broke into our house, and my husband had come home, and so that's actually how we sorted out what had happened, because he had just started out the window. And so then we were able to like walk through and figure out kind of the backstory, because there's almost always a backstory. This was a kid that I'd had in my home, right? Like, he was a friend of my son's, that he'd had a hard road. Do you know what I mean? Like, his life was intense. So we decided through much conversation that the restorative justice process was the right way. I really wanted him to have an opportunity to make this right, that wasn't going to turn his life in a really even harder direction that he was sort of already headed down. So then we came together for the circle itself, and we went through the process. We heard the story, we shared our point of view, we shared our concerns, we listened to this young man share back what he had heard. We got to hear his strengths, some of the things that really, he does well in this world, and then worked on an agreement, worked on what could be done to repair this harm. I would say the biggest change in him was actually the way that he was relating with his parents. So you could see in the early stages kind of like, this sort of body language and the parent like giving the what for, right? And then as that started to loosen up, you could see like where they were really hurting. And then again, like that's how we tailored the contract in some ways to start to address that piece. But here's the thing I know for sure, is that any person who sits through a 2.5 hour or more process like that and hears direct heart from the people who were there, if they're ever gonna perpetrate something like this again, if they're ever gonna go down this kind of road again, they're gonna have some second thoughts. For me, it was a pretty emotional event, more so of like that reckoning of like, here I am sitting in this actual seat as a victim, and my community, like the amount of pride that I had that my community afforded me this opportunity. I don't even know if I can put that into words. It's priceless. And then if I combine that with the fact of being a mother of teenagers, like, how do we have anything other than that? It's just what's right.
I think what we get caught up in organizations and communities is that we can somehow demand accountability, that I can go over and hold your arm and hold you accountable. Somehow that's going to cause you to be accountable. Or we get caught up, as I just talked about, in trying to legislate accountability, that the more laws we pass or the more rules and regs that we have with an organization, is somehow people are going to be more accountable. Or that we can even sometimes purchase accountability, that somehow we can put a carrot in front of somebody and hope that they're accountable. So the demanding, legislating, and purchasing of accountability doesn't work. What restorative justice does, and by the way, this is a volunteer process. Offenders have to volunteer to be involved, victims have to volunteer to be involved, but the offenders get this kind of opportunity to say, I did it, I'm responsible.
I drove up to Amy's house, I located her, I introduced myself. She recognized me from being the officer at the police department, and I kind of told her, now I understand why we're talking. She told me her side of the story was completely upfront. And one of the things I look at also is, does the suspected offender story match what the victim is telling me? Are they trying to minimize? Are they trying to leave things out because they don't want themselves to look bad? And Amy didn't do any of that. If anything, she was one of the more remorseful and honest people I dealt with in a long time. So I explained the restorative justice process to her as well, and she said, yeah, she would absolutely be on board with it. So those two elements is what I look for, is both the victim has to be on board with it and okay with it and willing to participate, and so does the offender. If either one of those pieces are missing, it's not going to happen, it won't be successful. So that's where we got Amy introduced to the program.
What I didn't know when I first came to LCJP was how bringing people together in that circle, that actually every person who comes to that circle will experience some sort of change, growth, or transformation. Initially, it might just look like the victim and offender, the harm party and responsible person. They're going to be the ones who learn and grow. But the more that you do this work, you realize that it's almost impossible to come into that room and participate in that conversation and not experience some sort of change of perspective, growth, new way of seeing yourself and the world as a consequence. Behavior is an expression of a need, right? So when we define a person by their one behavior, their one need, we sort of eliminate our understanding of the holistic aspects of a person, because that's what the criminal justice system so often does, right? We label somebody a vandal, a burglar, a thief, and that imprint stays with them because it limits their rights moving forward, or it leads to incarceration. The alternative with restorative justice is that we say we don't define a person by one choice. We look at why did they make that choice.
My take on human nature is that no one gets it right. We hurt people, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. But there's a part of us that has this desire to be remorseful, this desire to want to make amends, this desire to want to level the playing field and kind of bring back that equilibrium. And it just doesn't come from a perspective of serving themselves. It comes from a perspective of, I can be a better person. And I will be a better person, and I can grow from this. I just think that's there in our human nature. Restorative practices and principles and justice gives someone that opportunity.
And then we work on what's called a contract. And the contract consists of usually 3 to 5 or 6 items that they have to be something that's obtainable and documentable, as far as we can't say, just go do this. We have to give it, we have to quantify it. Okay, if you're going to volunteer, how many hours, where is it going to be? And it has to be relatable to what the crime was, what the incident was. And it also has to be able to show that it's repairing a harm. And Amy has as much of a say in what goes into her contract as I do, the community does, anyone does.
We really emphasize in restorative justice that one action, one decision doesn't have to define the person who caused harm. One of the ways that we do that is surface their strengths and talents and try to integrate those into the reparative contract. So after hearing the strengths, the whole group gets to brainstorm, what is it that the person taking responsibility, what can they do to try to repair the harmed relationship? So there's a brainstorm. Everybody is asked to contribute ideas except for the facilitators. We collect as many ideas as possible, and then we narrow those ideas down through a consensus process. And ultimately, there's a contract that usually has 3 to 5 specific measurable actions that the responsible person will take. Those go into a contract with a deadline. As long as the responsible person completes the contract by their deadline, they won't have any criminal charge on their record, and the case is closed. If they don't complete the contract or they reoffend during the contract duration, then the case is referred back to the referring officer and it goes through the conventional system. This is a painting titled Isolation. It was done by a 15-year-old girl who was referred to LCJP for shoplifting. And she did this piece as a self-reflection for her restorative contract for repair to self. So when she was caught and in the aftermath of the incident, she experienced a loss of trust amongst her family members and also with the friend that she was with at the time. And so she did this piece as an expression of the isolation that she felt as a result of her actions that would be then repaired through the restorative process. So this was almost like a closure piece for her to express how she had felt from her choice, but that she was going to be able to move on.
That is something that I think is so unique to this process and to this restorative justice, is that the offender doesn't just sit there and get pelted with all of these things that they're going to have to do, but they get an equal say in it as well. And they also get to come up with their own ideas. So by the end of the night, we all signed the contract, and Amy's held to that contract.
I feel like my process in restorative justice was a little bit unique because my family members actually decided not to participate after. So I went through the process kind of alone, which is where the community was huge for me. The community was able to fill in those gaps and help me with what I needed to do to right my wrong. And so I was able to hear others' point of view of why what I did was wrong, how it affects the community, and what I should do. And I took a number of steps that I wouldn't have thought to do on my own. And one of the issues with my crime is that my children were present. And so having the community give options to heal my children as well was just huge. And it not only helped the whole situation, but it made us way stronger as a family. And that was just, you can't even put a price on it. It was awesome.
I actually had one conference that I cried, but it involved a kid. And I had just had a heroin overdose of like a 17-year-old in the Jack in the Box bathroom, like 2-3 days before this. And I've got like kind of all that going at once, and I'm like sitting there thinking like, you know, your parents are looking at you like you're the worst person in the world, and I just pulled this dead kid out of a stall in Jack in the Box that died alone, and he's like your age. So I can almost get like caught up in it right now. And I'm like, and so you almost wish you could like take mom and dad and be like, dude, yeah, your kid screwed up, but whoa, your kid is not, you know, doing this type of behavior. So, you know, kind of ease up a little bit.
But something magical, and Beverly always used that term, something magical begins to happen inside of people when they go down that route, even though they may not be in that moment of wanting to take 100% accountability. Often they get to that point through the restorative justice process. So the restorative justice process creates a place that I will say is safe, and people are encouraged to become accountable, become that person that they want to be, and to let that remorse surface in a way that not only helps them, but also helps the victim and connects them more with the victim, and connects them more, interestingly enough, with our community.
I mean, I would have lost everything. I would have lost my kids, my career as a doctor, my housing. I live in a crime-free housing unit, so a felony would not be okay. So it's really amazing that I had that umbrella over me.
At one point, we had 5,000 Part 1 crimes. When we had 65,000 people, we had 5,000 Part 1 crimes. Now we have close to 100,000 people, and we have less than 3,000. At one point, we had 450 gang members. Now we have less than 50. At one point, we were trying to deal with 1 to 3, and in 1999 or 2000, we had 5 women die from domestic violence in this community. Over the last 20 years almost, we've had 2. Still 2 too many.
And it has the advantage of working.
Yeah,
you know, we put $1 billion into the Department of Corrections, $1 billion, and we have 20,000 people in the Department of Corrections. We have, you know, probably 10,000 people out there on parole, and maybe 100,000, 80,000 on probation in the state, and all of that costs money. Those systems are very, very expensive. And restorative justice, you know, you have a victim offender dialogue, and you have a facilitator who may be a volunteer working for a nonprofit organization, and they reach a reconciliation, and then they monitor the fulfillment of the requirements of the agreement.
Well, I'm really encouraged to say that in the 6 years that I've been working at LCJP, I've really noticed a drastic increase in the awareness about restorative justice in this community. So I often experience at a local business, at a store, or you know, a teacher, or maybe someone at like a hair salon, people more and more know somebody, a friend or a family member who's gone through our program or has heard something about it. So it's becoming less and less common that I meet people who have never heard of restorative justice at all. It's showing up in the media more too now. There's more TV shows that reference restorative justice.
So there's this culture, I think, in Longmont of cooperation, and if something is seen working well, there's this ability for it to catch on and get into other organizations and other situations. So rather than it just being about criminal justice, I would say the future of spreading is more that restorative justice finds its way into other processes, other situations beyond the schools, and more of even how can some of those practices just be used in my interactions with my family, with my friends, with other groups I work with.
Ideally, what I would like to see is that every police department has the opportunity to use and make referrals to restorative justice instead of charging someone if they feel like it's appropriate. Because that is happening way less than I thought. And so that's what I think is a really good first step, and I hope that eventually happens, that every police officer can use restorative justice if they think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think the future of restorative justice is very bright. I think it's going to grow. And it's when more people get exposed to knowing that there's options out there other than the criminal justice system. Not saying the criminal justice system isn't needed, it is. I deal with a lot of people that aren't appropriate for restorative justice. But I think the more people that learn about it, the more people that see it, the more people that experience it, the more they're willing to participate.
It may not manifest itself in its current form. You can use the principles of, you can use restorative principles and practices in a lot of ways. You can use them in your relationships. You can use them in schools as teachers work with parents. We're talking mostly about wayward behavior and crime here. But you can develop restorative communities. You can design new conversations that are built on, and structures and mechanisms that are built on the principles of restorative principles and practices. You can build those things. We're building those. And so I'm starting to see pockets around the country where that's happening. And I'm reading about those more than I've ever read about those things.
I am a huge advocate for restorative justice being implemented by an agency that's separate from government, separate from a criminal justice institution. And the reason for that is that restorative justice has to be guided by a different paradigm. It has to be informed by a different way of seeing the world. So you can't approach restorative justice within a paradigm that sees punitive responses as a solution, but just kind of add on restorative justice as a layer before you get to the punishment. The intention that you bring to restorative justice, the values with which you practice, and the integrity with which you practice are incredibly important, because that is what defines it. That's what makes it different than the criminal justice system. So for us in Longmont, being able to operate as an entity that's separate from police but works in partnership with police and courts means that we have the responsibility of upholding the authority of the restorative justice principles and values.
I think we're just scratching the surface with the possibilities of restorative justice. I'd like to see it as the first option for consideration by district attorneys.
So I think restorative justice is really important for where we find ourselves right now, because we have really latched on to a system, through criminal justice especially, a system that promotes denial of responsibility and leans heavily on an adversarial response. So the only way to resolve something is to first deny that I had any part in it, and then to say, I have to get as far away from the person that hurt me or that I hurt, because it's not safe to get any closer to them because it might be used against me, right? Like we live in this system of liability. There's so much fear. I think what we see out in the world today, especially in this country, are leaders and systems, institutions that are trying to promote fear and hatred. Restorative justice, on the other hand, asks people to get closer.
I believe we have a creator that binds us all and that we're all brothers and sisters on this planet. We sometimes use artificial boundaries as lines in a country or race or ethnicity or color as saying I'm different than you, but in essence I think we all have much more in common than we have what's different.
There's questions out there about, are people born with empathy or can they be taught empathy? I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think in my experience what I have seen is I might have this opinion before going through a conference or a restorative justice circle with someone that they don't think about others. And then I get to experience that and I realize that they do. So I do think that it is innate and we all have the ability to empathize. Sometimes we just have to literally be taught how to use that skill. And I think that that's one of the most valuable parts of restorative justice.
The two greatest human technologies, I will always say, are apology and forgiveness. And I saw that there might be room for people saying, I'm sorry, and people saying, I forgive you for what you did. I think those are powerful, powerful forces that are in our midst that go a long way in terms of repairing relationship, in terms of people choosing accountability, and in terms of victims having a voice in terms of what's happening to them. And so there you have it.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that film as much as I do. My name is Matt Kibbe. For those of you who caught on late, I am the president and chief community organizer at Free the People. We produced that film. And the thing I love about this film is that it is so emotionally compelling that I watch it and I finish it and I want to do something. I want to act. And that's really the purpose of the Q&A that we're going to have right now. And let me start by introducing everybody and give it over to them. If you haven't asked yet, make sure to ask a question in the comments and we will try to get to as many as possible. There's some themes that have developed, so we'll probably be able to cover a few. Kathleen McGoy, wave Kathleen, is executive director at the LCJP, a nonprofit agency that implements restorative justice programs and trainings for schools, law enforcement, and nonprofit agencies. Kathleen has a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from the University of Innsbruck, Austria, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame. She began facilitating conversations about social justice in Tijuana, Mexico, while serving as the executive director of a nonprofit called Los Embajadores. How's my Spanish, Kathleen? Was that right? So I win for that. Next, and by the way, Kathleen is obviously a superstar in this movie, a rock star, and we're just blessed that she was willing to take time out of her rock star schedule and join us tonight. Next, another rock star, Chief Mike Butler, has been a public servant. Wave, Mike. Has been a public servant for 4 decades, serving in the role of police chief and public safety chief. During his tenure, he was able to radically change the police culture in Longmont, Colorado, to one in which police officers and public safety staff shifted to utilizing many different options and alternatives to the criminal justice system to respond to the plethora of health and social issues they encountered. These options included extensive use of restorative principles, practices, and justice, as well as the development of large-scale service responses to more effectively assist those struggling with their mental health and addiction. Mike is a nationally renowned speaker, writer, and consultant in what it requires to shift police and community cultures to work more effectively together to address community-wide social and health issues. Next, we have Sam Martin. Sam Martin is the creative director at Free the People and founder and CEO of Sam Martin Productions. Sam is one of our rock star storytellers at Free the People. He is the co-director of this movie. He has over a decade of experience in cinematic storytelling, acting, and presidential campaign ads, short films, commercials, scripted web series, music videos, and online promotional content. He also happens to be a star of a new video series at Free the People. If you want to check him out more, check him out at Free the People. I shouldn't have to read that bio, by the way, Sam. I feel like I should.
You should have it memorized.
Yeah. And finally, Glenn Glod from Americans for Prosperity. He is the Criminal Justice Policy Fellow at AFP, based in Arlington, Virginia. Glod is an attorney who began his legal career as a law clerk for the Honorable Judge Laura S. Ripken on the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County, Maryland. He subsequently practiced at a litigation firm in Annapolis, Maryland, before joining Right on Crime and the Texas Public Policy Foundation as the Director of State Initiatives for Criminal Justice. Okay, Sam. Sam is our moderator, and he is going to be fielding your question. We actually have a team of people trying to pull the best questions and sending them to Sam. And Sam, let's roll.
Cool, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I just want to welcome everyone to this film. We're so glad we have such a great audience for this. During COVID times, it's really difficult to show a film, obviously. So we're innovating, we're showing it in any way that we can. So this has been really cool to be able to do this. So I want to give a quick background on the film. I'm one of the co-directors. The other director is Matt Battaglia. It was such an adventure filming this thing and going down this journey. Honestly, the way that it started was we didn't really know about restorative justice, and we got connected to the topic through somebody we work with, and we explored it and we loved it, and we thought it was the exact type of transpartisan issue that Free the People deals with. We love these issues that everyone can get behind. So it was just perfect in that way. Our original plan was to shoot a crime thriller and to follow a victim and offender through the process in real time. We found out very quickly that's not really possible, or it's very difficult to do that. But I love the magic of filmmaking because it takes you down roads that you don't really expect. And eventually, through a series of connections, we found Longmont and we found Mike and Kathleen. And it's really a unique partnership that we found with them and through this community. That's just a great, as you can see, it's a great template for restorative justice around the country. So we're just so happy to find this place. And really, the documentary turned into what you saw, which is basically a how-to manual for other communities around the country to be able to implement these principles into their own communities, into their own towns, while highlighting some of the crimes, some of the stories, some of the different ways in which this plays out in practice. And what we found is that it's lower level crimes, it's misdemeanors. Those are really the majority of the crimes that most towns are going to be dealing with around the country. So it was the perfect, you know, set of stories for us to find that other communities could implement. So with that background, let's move on to some questions. Let's see. So Kathleen, we've gotten this question several times before. There's always the question about representation in our film. And I wonder if you could address this and talk about kind of some of the, what does it actually look like in practice? And then maybe some of the difficulties in getting different minority representation in the documentary itself.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking, Sam. So when you say representation, you're talking about racial diversity, right?
Yes.
That's where many questions were coming in. Yeah, and I want to appreciate and just recognize the importance of people voicing those questions and acknowledge that, especially at this time in this country, the issue of racial justice and racial equity throughout systems is receiving the attention that it deserves, and that it's requiring that it didn't always receive. So I want to just value the questions coming in and appreciate the people using their voice to ask those questions. I want to start kind of big and then get focused, starting with the restorative justice movement and then focus down to the film. First of all, it has been on the minds of restorative justice professionals for as many years as I've been involved in this work, which is 7, that restorative justice, if it is not practiced through a racial equity lens, runs the risk of perpetuating the racial injustices that we see playing out in the criminal justice system, which of course is highly problematic and goes against the goals and values of restorative justice. And so in every national conference, from the national level, state level, local level, how to make sure that we are prioritizing and putting forth the voices of more racial groups, making sure that this is not a movement that is dominated by white voices, white privileged voices, is something that we are working on ongoing. In Longmont, our community is 70%, close to 70% white, close to 30% Latinx, and less than 5% Asian and Black. So in our community, what we are really looking at is, one, our caseload does reflect those demographics, meaning the responsible parties who were referred to restorative justice are approximately 70% white, 30% Latinx. Something that's really important to us that we want to put forth to other communities is that when we work with an individual who is undocumented, or perhaps they have a family member who's undocumented, that doesn't need to be addressed in restorative justice, and it doesn't limit anyone's participation. We don't even actually need to ask. Now, our volunteer pool is the area where LCJP is constantly trying to improve, and I want to take responsibility as the leader of LCJP that we have not managed to recruit volunteers who reflect the demographics of our community. One of the things that I was sharing with this group before we got on with the Q&A is we recognize that in order for people to commit to being volunteer facilitators, they need to have time and money, which means that we're often looking at retired folks who have that resource and are able to give their time. So one thing we're exploring is considering providing a stipend to volunteers so that we can hopefully recruit from a broader range of socioeconomic backgrounds. So then just last, focusing in on this film. First, I want to say that we did our best to recruit some folks from racially diverse backgrounds in the scenes where you see the circles, where there's no sound, but we have like a mock restorative justice conference going on. There is actually quite a bit of racial diversity from our community represented there. Now, when we look at the interviews, like Mike and I were interviewed quite a bit, and then Amy, our responsible person, and the officer who worked closely with her, and we are all white. And I will acknowledge that one of the challenges is that many people don't want to go on film talking about their restorative justice experience. And so we were just really fortunate to have the officers and Amy be willing to take that step. And I think if we have the opportunity to expand on the film, we would certainly prioritize and do whatever we could to try to have some more racially diverse voices participating in those interviews.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kathleen. Yeah, and I'll just add to that. This is just a short documentary. We're planning on making a full-length one. There were many people who wanted to interview, and sometimes it's just a matter of logistics and getting to everyone, but we will definitely prioritize that for the full length. We are getting a lot of questions here. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We may not be able to get to all of them tonight, just want to let people know, but we'll go through as many as we can. So let's go through some of the more nuts and bolts of the program. Maybe I'll go to Mike on this one. So Mike, talk about how severe can a crime be and still qualify for restorative justice? Restorative justice. Is it just misdemeanors, felonies? Are there particular types of crimes that qualify? And you're muted, by the way, Mike. You're muted, yeah.
We started off, we've been doing restorative justice in Longmont for 25 plus years. We started off with misdemeanors, we started off with kids, and we started off with first-time offenders. And after a year or two, we moved into misdemeanors, felonies, kids and adults, and first-time plus multiple people who have been arrested and gone through the criminal justice system a few or several times. So, you know, one of the prerequisites of restorative justice in Longmont is that the person who was harmed and the person who committed the harm have to agree to be involved with it. And so that's a requisite, notwithstanding the nature of the crime itself. But I will say we've had many, many different kinds of felonies, mostly property felonies. But as you said, Sam, the vast majority of communities, the majority of crime end up being property kinds of crime, theft, burglaries, car break-ins. We will work with certain kinds of violent crime that are on the lower end. We will not work with domestic violence at this point. That's not on the table for us to work with because of the nature and dynamics that go along with domestic violence. But I also want to say that I think the future holds promise because what we're seeing across America is that even with serious crimes, the criminal justice, the recidivism of people going through the criminal justice system is still high. And I still think it's incumbent upon us as academicians, practitioners, whoever we are, to figure out another way to deal with people who have committed serious crime and people who have been victims of serious crime. You know, we're kind of caught in the past and tradition, custom, and there are times when the DA or a police officer won't want to refer crime to restorative justice because it's way too serious, or because this person's been arrested 6 or 7 times. That was kind of a past thing for police. We've convinced our police officers, you know what, if we've tried something that many times and it didn't work, maybe it's time to try something else. And so we are using restorative justice for misdemeanors and felonies, and we want to be able to expand that.
Great, thank you for that. So for people listening that are from other towns, other communities around the country, how do you implement a program like this? And how do you ensure that it's accessible to all and not just low risk folks, but anyone that could benefit from it? And maybe I'll start with Kathleen on this one.
Yeah, I'll share my perspective, and then I'd love to hear Mike, since Mike was around since the beginning of our work with LCJP. And I will say that it's just incredibly important from the very beginning to involve as many stakeholders as possible. So for example, right now I've been getting a lot of inquiries from individuals around the country, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies. And one of the things that comes up is how to work with victim advocates. And that's a really great example of starting those stakeholder conversations really early. So restorative justice, while beneficial to communities because it reduces recidivism or reoffense, is truly meant to be victim-centered. And so, yes, you want to engage and get the buy-in, get the support of victim advocates and victim services specialists from the very beginning so that they can help inform the restorative justice implementation and make it victim-centered. Then I would say all of the actors who might have an opportunity to touch this system, so whether that's prosecutors, law enforcement agents, public defenders, community serving groups, youth serving agencies, having conversations with all of them and doing your best to tell stories and share the data. So some people want the numbers, some people want the success stories. And that's true even within our Longmont Police Department. When we're going in and doing training, initially we thought, oh, they just all want to hear the numbers. But that's not actually the case because they interact with so many people's stories day in and day out that it's really important for them to hear the success stories of restorative justice. And then I would say, collect as much data as you can about the many different programs that are occurring throughout the country. There's some programs that are focusing more on high impact, high stakes, violent crimes and using restorative justice models successfully. So making sure that you can connect and draw from those past experiences and bring that information to your community will help keep the possibilities of restorative justice expansive. Also, I'll just add one more thing, making sure that there's a plan in place for sustaining the program. So what we've seen in Colorado is that the biggest challenge to restorative justice when it's implemented in a community model like ours via a nonprofit, the biggest challenge is funding. And so it's really important to have a plan in place for how you will fund this type of work for at least 3 to 5 years, making sure that you're compensating people adequately, of course, so that you can have those success stories and make sure that the community learns how it's working.
Well, thank you so much for that, Kathleen. I think, Mike, you're muted again.
About that. So I'll jump in here and say that, right now is probably as good an opportunity to begin a restorative justice program in your community as I've ever seen. We started it without a crisis. We didn't have people pushing us to try something new. We kind of figured out that we needed to do something new. But right now, there's hardly a community that's not trying to figure out what other options and alternatives are there that they can use outside of what we've been doing with the traditional criminal justice system. So riding that wave of momentum can be very important right now. And that momentum can take you a long, long ways. The other thing I'm going to say is if you want to give the caller or any caller my phone number, I'll be happy to take that phone call, because this is a long answer with talking about what Kathleen talked about with just implementation and sustainability. There's a lot of programs that get off the ground, but there's a lot of programs that don't sustain themselves. And oftentimes when budget cuts come, the new thing on the block kind of gets cut. And so there's some magic and there's some secrets and there are some strategies, but it's a long conversation that I'm willing to have with anybody who wants to give me a call on that. But I will just say, going back to the beginning, I'm going to mention Dr. Beverly Title and I applied for a grant. We got the money, but we actually started restorative justice in 5 different communities, not just Longmont. We didn't want Longmont to be the only community. We wanted to be able to share and have other communities' experiences too. So it didn't look like we were on that cutting or bleeding edge alone by ourselves. And some of those communities have sustained it for a while. And as Kathleen said, we kept track of the data. One of the things we initially did was we hired an outside firm to come in and do all the assessment of the data. We didn't assess it. And so every other year that assessment came through. But I will tell you this, more than anything, sometimes when you start something new, you can be that voice in the wilderness, and the only antidote to the sacrifice of being that lone person is your own commitment. And so your commitment has to be high for this. And if you can find other champions for that level, with that level of commitment, great. I would go to key people, key leaders, mayors, city council people, police chiefs, school board presidents, school board superintendents, and get audiences with those folks and begin to talk about it. Because sometimes I can tell you, police chiefs and police departments are thinking, well, how do we put together a restorative justice process? And if people come in and say, we're willing to do it, you might have that wave of momentum right now like you've never had before. And you know, we're not going to be defunding police departments to the extent that some people have said, but I can guarantee you, I literally guarantee you that there are police departments that are willing to repurpose funding to make this happen. And so the opportunity is there right now. And if someone wants to give me a call on some more details, happy to have that conversation.
Perfect. We'll post his number in YouTube after this. So Greg, I want to bring you into this conversation. So can you talk to us a little bit about how Americans for Prosperity's general overall vision on criminal justice reform and how restorative justice fits into that? And then how different people in the community can get involved with AFP with this type of thing?
Yeah, no, certainly. And so, you know, at Americans for Prosperity, one of our guiding principles is that every person has a unique gift that allow them to realize the American dream. And so what we've come to notice is the criminal justice system really undermines that guiding principle. And these government solutions, this one-size-fits-all approach, we see how much failure there is and how many generations of individuals and lives have been damaged because of the criminal justice system. And really, you know, leave it to government. It's really the only thing that can continue to fail and actually expand. And we've seen this expansion into punishment and retribution, and not focusing on community, not focusing on victims, not focusing on the individual to actually have them be successful. So that's what I love about this restorative justice process and how this fits into AFP. It's a community-based solution that focuses on the community. Government-based solutions focus on government, and they prioritize government. And I'll give an example of that. We were just working on a bill in Michigan, and it would have allowed for record sealing, you know, for a conviction after a certain amount of time, you do certain things. And so one of the sticking points going on there is, you know, making sure individuals paid all their restitution to a victim. And, you know, minds can debate on, you know, the intricacies of that, but that's neither here nor there for this example. The problem was in Michigan, there's no way to track how much restitution has been paid because the government's not getting paid from that. And so when we're talking about victims and making them whole, the government really may not have their best frames in mind. And so there's a lot of frustration when it comes to victims. Victims really want to become whole. They want to move forward. And that's what I love about this program, that it allows for a victim, it allows for someone who's committed fault to look each other in their eye, understand where each one of them has come from, and have a community-based solution that not only brings recidivism down, not only brings an individual back into the community, but also makes a victim whole. And the criminal justice system, time and time again, frustrates both of those goals. And so seeing what's going on in Colorado and other jurisdictions have put together restorative justice, these are the types of solutions that we should be seeing across the country. And so please, if you can, please reach out to Mike as much as possible so we can get this keep going across the country, because these are the types of things we need to show. I mean, after generations and generations of what we've done in the criminal justice system, it's not working. And so seeing these types of community-based solutions, a bottom-up approach is where we need to continue to go. And Sam, to answer your next question, you know, I worked in legislative offices, you know, in Maryland, at Congress, worked in the Texas legislature. I know when lawmakers or, you know, elected officials get calls from citizens on specific legislation or just policies, if they get one call, things are going to start to tether around. They get 2 or 3 calls on the same policy, the alarm starts sounding. And so, you know, from ASP standpoint, get educated from, you know, some of our grassroots training academies that we have across the country. We're located in 35 states. And if you go to our website, you can see each state that we have. We have significant training academies that'll show how activists can get involved and create coalitions, start asking the right questions of sheriffs and judges and local lawmakers on what are they doing to ensure that not only are individuals victims becoming whole, but how are we bringing people back into our community? And I think those are questions that are not being asked enough by the community. You know, we ask a lot of different things, but this is a major issue. 95% of people that are in prison are going to be coming back into your society. And so are we leaving them better off when they come out, or are they going to be worse off? I think one of the most telling things about the documentary was talking about how many times local law enforcement had already had initiations or contacts with these people prior, 8, 9 arrests, and then they have another carjacking. And so that's not good for public safety. That's not good for the community. That's not good for the individual. You need to start tackling the underlying issues of crime and punishment's really not getting to that. And so that's what I love about this program and issue. And so please feel free to reach out to me and the rest of our AFP team. And we have a lot of information and educational tools and training academies that we can really get you educated on this and how to effectively change policy at your local level.
And if I could add on, I thought that was a great answer, a great response. If I could add on to that, when we're talking implementation, we've only really talked about, well, what's an entity need to do to get this up and running? There's another thing that needs to be dealt with, and that is the community's response to this. Because often the community has defined justice as a pound of flesh or an eye for an eye. And restorative practices and principles define justice completely differently. And so one of the things that's happened in Longmont over the past 2+ decades has been we've gotten somewhere between 15 and 20,000 community members involved in this program in one way or another. And that has helped kind of shift the definition of what justice is. And it has made restorative justice much more acceptable when you want to talk about sustaining it for the long term.
Thank you both so much for that. I'm afraid we are running out of time here. So we're gonna have to wrap up this section of the Q&A. But for anyone that got the invite for the VIP Zoom, now is the time to switch over or to get onto Zoom, and we can continue this conversation there. For everyone else, I just want to thank you all for joining and for watching this special film. And Kibby, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, go get it done. But no pressure at all, but the responsibility is on everybody participating. This is a bottom-up approach. It's a community-based approach. And we have some experts here that just volunteered time that they probably don't even have to give you to get that going. And we're wanting to see this franchise model out. We don't need Washington, D.C. We don't need state capitals. We just need you and your communities and all of your partners. And together, you guys can get this done.
I just wanted to add that I'm also available, as Mike mentioned and Matt just mentioned. It's a real goal for LCJP. We feel it's living out our mission as a nonprofit to assist other communities to implement this model. That's how we can make a greater impact. And also, we have this asset of having done this work for 25 years. And so even if your community wants to implement slightly differently than the way that our model looks exactly, we're happy to provide you support and resources so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we can share with you how we've learned along the way. So please feel free to reach out. I shared my email in a chat here, so that can get distributed out to all of you, and I appreciate the interest.
Cool, thank you, Kathleen, and thanks for everyone that tuned in, and let's continue this conversation in Zoom.